This is Anything for You. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 5. Chapter 9. Monday morning, McCoy sat at his desk, trying to catch up on some paperwork. He avoided his office and desk as much as he could. He'd become an animal control officer because he loved animals and hated sitting inside. This part of the job was his least favorite. He'd left his door cracked, and a tap on it pushed it open farther. Louis walked in with a piece of paper in his hand. Never a good sign. It would be a complaint of some kind. McCoy waited. Louis looked over the paper. "I think this is the same address as the elephant." McCoy's heart skidded to a stop. What had happened? He'd felt awful that Jillian had admitted to not being able to afford a meal, but it actually made him admire her more. She was obviously feeding her animals quite well, and she was willing to go without in order to keep doing it. He'd gone to the diner and ordered 2 meals for takeout. The lights were off in Jillian's house, but he left her container on the banister. It was cool enough it wouldn't spoil. Hopefully she saw it. Louis browsed the paper some more. Apparently there was a wedding at the property. He nodded. He'd not gone out to inspect Heidi's pen, not only because he'd just been there Friday, but also because of the wedding. A little girl got bitten by one of the dogs that were being kenneled. I don't have any more info. You have time today to check this out? Yeah. He pushed back on his chair. He hadn't wanted to do the paperwork anyway. I'll head out there right now. I have a few more things I need to do anyway. Okay. Figured I'd give this one to you because you've been working with the woman. He stopped talking and looked McCoy full in the face. I know Todd was messing with you some the other day in my office, but you really don't have a thing for her, do you? Because you know I'd need to take you off the case if you do. A man gets tangled up in a relationship and his rational thought suffers. No, I'm not having any trouble thinking rationally. She hadn't wanted to eat with him. That was a pretty big clue that there wasn't any attraction or interest on her end. He'd spent the weekend convincing himself that there was no interest on his end either. It wasn't true, but it was just as well. A woman who'd traveled as Jillian had wouldn't be interested in a homebody like him. He couldn't believe that he'd actually blurted out that he'd lived in the same house all his life. His fiancée hadn't been impressed with that little detail of his life. Good. Louis handed McCoy the slip of paper and walked out. It was a little over a half an hour from the office to Sweet Haven Farm where Jillian's kennel was. He pulled slowly into the drive, waving at Avery as she walked up the steps to the big farmhouse. She'd be living with Gator, of course, but he thought she was still in charge of the receptions at the barn. She'd have been the one setting things up and supervising on Saturday. He wanted to talk to Jillian first. The dog was under her care. He slowed when he went by her small house, but the place looked unoccupied, so he continued on to the kennels. She was out cleaning them. Part of his body dreaded having to confront her about the girl's bite. The other part of him jumped up and down in excitement to have an excuse to be near her again. He stopped and got out. She glanced up, her eyes widening in surprise. She probably hadn't heard him approach over the barking of the dogs. Her eyes swept down his body and back up, noting the uniform. Wariness leapt into her expression and her chest expanded like she was taking a big breath. She set the shovel aside and let herself out of the kennel, striding over to him. He liked that. She wasn't trying to hide, and she didn't make him chase her down. but confronted her problem head-on.
"Hello, Mr. Rodning."
Her soft, musical tone sounded perfect to his ears, but he hated that she put that distance between them with the Mr. "How's Heidi?"
"She's doing great. I got a load of hay delivered here early Saturday morning, and I'm checking with a couple of tree trimming companies to see if I can get some branches to supplement her diet."
He nodded. That was a great idea. It would probably be free, too, unlike hay, which was expensive, especially this time of year. "Glad to hear that. Maybe, since I'm here, I can do the unscheduled visit, if it suits you." She pushed the hair that had escaped from her ponytail back off her face. Her face was flushed from the work she'd been doing, and she looked slim in her t-shirt and soft-looking blue jeans. He noted she wore the work gloves he'd bought her. Her hands were probably still tender.
"I don't think it will work today. I have a class starting in about 30 minutes.
He tried for his best professional look. "Okay. I don't want to make you late, but we have a report of a little girl getting bitten by one of your dogs. Can you tell me what happened?" The wary look on her face intensified, but her voice stayed level and she looked him in the eye.
"Sure. She was attending the wedding at the barn with her parents, and she slipped away. Apparently, they didn't notice. She came down here and stuck her hand in between the chain-link fence."
She pointed to what looked like a husky mix.
"I don't think the dog meant to hurt her, but he was probably excited."
"Was she bleeding?"
"No, nothing punctured the skin. There was one small indentation in her finger that could have been made by a tooth, but nothing else."
She lifted a shoulder.
"I have the parents' number."
"Do you mind giving it to me?"
"Not at all. I told them that they'd probably be getting a call from my insurance agent, if no one else, because they decided to take her to the ER."
"Okay, great. So they'd be expecting a call. Hopefully they told the same story Jillian just did. Thanks." He stood, thinking about whether there was anything else he needed to ask before he turned to go.
"McCoy."
His heart flipped at her use of his name. "Yeah?"
"I'm sorry about Friday night."
He didn't say anything, didn't allow the excited beating of his heart to change the expression on his face. She twisted her hands together before taking her gloves off and slapping them on her leg.
"I ran away and it wasn't nice of me."
She bit her lip.
"Thanks for the meal. It was my breakfast the next morning."
"You're welcome." He looked over her head, needing to address her apology. "It's probably better that way."
"Yeah."
His phone buzzed, and he was tempted not to look at it, but he didn't have anything else to add, so he pulled it out of his pocket. "You might as well let her know that I've gotten 2 complaints about the elephant. Wedding guests." McCoy closed his eyes. It seemed like everything was against Jillian. He hated to add to it, but she needed to know. "This is my boss." He held up his phone, keeping the screen pointed toward him. "People from the wedding must have seen Heidi. They're complaining, apparently. I'm not sure about what, but it doesn't matter. We have to investigate all complaints."
"I see."
"I know you have a class. I can walk down to the barn, make sure she has food and water and that our fence is holding." He got a little thrill out of saying "our fence," but the dejected set of her shoulders hurt his heart. She swallowed and nodded.
"That's fine."
"You know, Jillian, not to make your life harder, but it might not be the best idea to have an elephant near where there are going to be wedding guests possibly wandering around. I know she's a very calm animal, but she's big enough that things could get ugly fast."
"I understand."
She wouldn't meet his eyes, instead focusing on the gravel under their feet. Her shoulders were turned away, like she wanted to leave but was staying for politeness. I'm sorry. She nodded.
Is that it?
Yes, for now.
Do I need to go to the barn with you?
He hated to leave her, didn't want to be the person who made her feel bad, but he'd already done more for her than he should, more than Louis would think was acceptable. No, he gritted his jaw. Is there a wedding this Saturday? We can schedule my next visit since I can count this one as the unscheduled.
No, but wildlife days are Saturday and Sunday afternoon. I'm doing some presentations with your uncle's dogs.
She looked up, giving him a ghost of a smile. That's right. He was giving his own presentation on snakes. How's Friday?
That's fine.
I'll see you then. He left, because he had to. Chapter 10. Tuesday morning, Jillian stopped at Uncle Roy's house to work with his dogs and to check on him. She wasn't sure exactly what McCoy did during the week when he didn't come home, but supposedly it related to his job somehow. Regardless, she enjoyed visiting with Uncle Roy, and she enjoyed working with his dogs as well. They had a nice visit before she jogged to the post office and then back home, where her day didn't exactly go as planned. It didn't surprise Jillian when McCoy's truck came slowly down the drive on Wednesday morning. She'd been expecting it since her confrontation with a student and his handler at her Tuesday night obedience class. She quit cleaning the pins and waited for him to stop and get out. "This is getting to be a bit of a habit," he said by way of greeting. If only he weren't here because of more complaints. He looked fabulous in his uniform, strong and confident. But she knew there was kindness and consideration there as well. The combination was addictive and attractive. She had to remind herself he was off limits.
I should get you your own parking space. Put up a sign that says, "This space reserved for animal control officer."
He smiled, but it didn't stretch to his eyes. "I guess you know why I'm here." She nodded. "Can you tell me what happened?" She shoved a hand in her pocket and leaned a shoulder against the metal building. The dog's barking frenzy had died down enough for him to be able to hear her.
I have a pit bull in my Tuesday night class. I know they have a reputation, but they're actually great with people and really sweet.
Dumb, too. But it wasn't really their fault. They'd been bred to fight, not to use their brains.
But he's not so keen on his fellow students. I had to ask his handler to leave after he started showing aggression toward the Irish wolfhound in the class. I didn't want a dogfight on my hands.
Of course. McCoy nodded.
They left, but the handler shouted a few insults on the way out, complaining that the place smells and is dirty, that I'm a fake and fraud.
That insult had smarted, because it was so close to the truth.
He said he was going to report me. I have the names and numbers of the other students in the class if you'd like to confirm my story.
Yeah, I'll take them. His lips pressed together. We've been getting so many complaints about you that my supervisor is thinking about making a trip out here. She bit her cheeks. He pulled the ever-present gum out of his pocket. She gave a shaky laugh before taking a piece.
Is that something I should worry about? Your supervisor coming out?
One side of his mouth pulled back and he crossed his arms over his chest. He's not happy about the elephant not having a permit. He's on me to push you about it. Legally, you have 30 days, but... He shrugged. I want to say that my supervisor would do the exact same things I'm doing, but I'm not sure that's true. He lifted a shoulder. Jillian didn't need him to tell her Louis wouldn't come and help her make a fence. He wouldn't have offered to buy her supper. maybe McCoy was playing favorites. Jillian bit her cheeks despite the gum he'd given her. His chest tightened. She pulled something deep inside of him. Whatever it was, it made him feel protective of her. It also drove him to seek her out, to run his eyes over her face, to want to touch her and make her life easier. He didn't want to give up his authority to Louie, and especially not to Todd. McCoy wanted to be the one to be here for Jillian. Maybe that was a good reason for him to walk away.
"But should I worry about him coming out?"
Jillian asked again. "I'm going to do what I can, and no, you don't need to worry." Something like relief eased the lines in her face. He only hoped he could live up to that promise. Saturday was a beautiful, warm day. The forsythia bushes were in full bloom. Early tulips and late daffodils colored lawns, while the grass was an almost electric shade of green. Fresh, new earth scented the air, even over the roasting hot dogs and fried food smells that soaked through the town of Love. It was Wildlife Days, and Love didn't do small celebrations. Enough people milled around that Love could almost be mistaken for Pittsburgh, minus the hills and rivers and skyscrapers. Jillian would never confuse the small town she'd fallen in love with a big city, though. Everyone knew almost everyone else, and if they didn't, they smiled and greeted each other anyway. Sure, she was looked on with a bit of suspicion, since she wasn't born and raised in the area, or maybe she would be looked at like that no matter where she went. At any rate, there were a ton of people gathered around as she held on to Chatty and Bubbles. Snickers was off-leash, sitting under a stay command. One could never be 100% sure about how an animal was going to behave, but Jillian had as much confidence as a person could have in Snickers. Uncle Roy sat in a lawn chair in the front row. Jillian had offered to see if Avery or Ellie would pick him up, but he said McCoy was coming and would bring him. Sure enough, 30 minutes before she was scheduled to begin, Uncle Roy had hobbled over, his dogs on leash. McCoy walked beside him carrying the lawn chair. Their eyes met, his dark and brooding, but a small smile had tilted his lips up. She had to return it. The air had seemed to sizzle around them, and the noise of the townspeople faded as they became the only two people in the world for several long seconds. Uncle Roy had said something and broken the spell, but Jillian was having a harder and harder time convincing herself that there was nothing between herself and McCoy. What wasn't hard was convincing herself it wouldn't last. She knew nothing could ever come of it. Jillian tried to keep her mind off McCoy, who was somewhere nearby doing something with his job. Maybe Uncle Roy had mentioned snakes. Several small children gathered around Bubbles and Chatty, petting them while the dogs tried to lick their faces and snuggle up. They loved the attention and were great with kids. Jillian bent down, answering questions and making sure the smallest children weren't pushed over. She took a second to check her watch. The parade was over, more people were gathering, and it was time to start her demonstration.
"Okay, we're going to get started."
This was much better than the circus, where she had to wear a frilly costume and everything was done to the beat of fast-paced music. People settled back and Uncle Roy smiled from the front. As she put the dogs through the tricks she'd taught them, she explained several main principles of training. People seemed interested, and she hoped it helped them as they worked on training their own dogs. The most popular part of her demonstration seemed to be when she combined her contortionist routine with the dog's obedience. Maybe because people didn't typically see that. Whatever the reason, when she was finished, people begged to see them again. The dogs were game, so she obliged the crowd. Instead of working an hour, she ended up doing 2 hours of demonstrations, another hour of questions, and more tricks. She had a feeling the audience at the end was an entirely different audience than at the beginning, because who could watch that long? But they were just as engaged, which warmed her chest and made her feel light and bubbly inside. Uncle Roy watched the whole time. After telling the audience she was really done this time, she walked over to him.
"What do you think?"
"I think you're the best thing that's ever happened at Wildlife Days." His whiskered face split into a grin. "I think I even learned some things, and they were my dogs." He shook his head. "I can't believe they were my dogs. Why can't I get them to do that stuff at home?" She smiled.
"I know you can. It just takes practice. The more you work with them, the better you understand them, and they understand you."
"Sounds like a marriage to me," the old man said with a twinkle in his eye. Jillian kept her smile, although part of her had despaired over ever getting married.
"I don't have any experience in that area."
"I can tell you it ain't easy." He rubbed his hand over his face. "Mabel and I couldn't have kids. Then God took her early. Guess I'm kind of glad McCoy's parents had such a hard time, and he ended up with me." Jillian couldn't deny she was curious.
"Someone said he'd lived in your house all his life?"
"Yeah, I bought the house from his parents about 20 years ago, about when Mabel died. His mom ran off, and his dad was struggling. He has sisters, you know." No, Jillian hadn't known. They didn't stick around either, looking for something more exciting than this one-horse town.
"So he's the only steady one in his family?"
"My little brother, his dad, isn't bad, but he moved to Florida to be with his new wife and family. She left him, but he doesn't want to come back." He patted Chatty, who had made herself at home in his lap. She really wanted to hear more about McCoy's family, but he probably wouldn't appreciate her digging.
"Do you want to walk around a little?"
she offered. "Nah." He kept his hand moving on his dog's head. "I've seen all this 100 times. McCoy's co-worker is relieving him in a few minutes. I'll go home with him." Someone tapped her on the shoulder.
"Do you think you could teach my dog to do all that stuff?"
She turned, her response natural on her lips.
"Sure. Pretty much any dog can learn the basics."
The girl, maybe in her late teens, nodded. Jillian realized there was a line of people waiting to ask her questions. She hadn't expected this.
"Let me pour some water for Snickers and come over here so I can sit down."
With a last look at Uncle Roy, who appeared to be in good shape, Jillian led the line over to the small makeshift platform she'd used for her demonstration. She poured some of the water she'd brought into Snicker's bowl, and the dog lapped at it. People gathered around her when she sat down and peppered her with questions. She was in the middle of an explanation of the best house training practices when she noticed McCoy come for Uncle Roy. He glanced over at her and their eyes met, but she looked away immediately. She would never be able to answer questions if she spent all her time staring at his rugged jaw and wide shoulders. The crowd had thinned, her stomach was crying in hunger, and she'd answered more questions than she'd ever thought she could when the hair on the back of her neck pricked up, and she noticed McCoy standing off to her right with his arms crossed over his chest, his legs braced. Her heart stuttered at the handsome picture, but her brain warned her that if he wanted to talk to her, it probably wasn't good. Her stomach forgot about being hungry and commenced nervous cramping. Now what? More complaints? She finished speaking to the lady in front of her. Before anyone else could ask her anything, McCoy materialized by her right elbow. "She's done for now, folks. The lady hasn't eaten anything today, and she looks like she's ready to fall over. You can find her at Fink and Ellie's if you want to talk to her." McCoy's voice was kind, yet firm, and folks good-naturedly moved away. She crossed her arms and tapped her foot.
"That was presumptuous of you."
"Yeah." He looked at her with the look that could melt stone. Her body was not immune, but she tried to resist.
"You're not going to apologize?"
"No." His breathing was steady, and his eyes didn't flinch.
"I think you should."
Her voice didn't come out like she wanted it to. Rather, it was more of a whisper. "You are hungry. You are tired. And you need a break." His lips flattened. "There's nothing to apologize for."
"I can make these decisions on my own."
She was arguing for no good reason. It was actually nice to have someone take care of her. The circus had been like one big family, and she missed that aspect. But she had always been on her own with taking care of herself. McCoy swallowed and his eyes moved to a point over her shoulder. "I'm sorry. You look exhausted." His eyes met hers again. "Walk with me for a bit and let me get you something to eat." Her stomach spun like a cotton candy machine. She should tell him no. She should leave. There was plenty of work to do at home, even though she'd canceled her Saturday classes because of the festival.
"Okay."
His lip curved up. "Really? No argument? You must be pretty hungry."
"I am. How did you know I hadn't eaten all day?"
"Just figured." He knew the state of her bank account, although she'd bought the hay and dog food and cut a rent check. She had a little bit left. She could buy groceries. Rice and beans. She'd grown up on them. With the right spices, they were delicious. And cheap. "We taking Snickers with us?" he asked. She eyed the dog, sleeping beside the platform, sprawled out in the sun.
"I'd better bring her with me."
"Leash?"
"She'll be fine. Snickers, heel."
Snickers jumped up, did a quick stretch, and came to Jillian's side. Jillian dug in her pocket for her last treat.
"We're ready,"
she said. "What do you feel like?" McCoy asked, waiting for her to come to his side before starting to stroll to where all the food vendors were set up.
"Anything I don't have to kill first."
He looked at her oddly. She wanted to slap her hand over her mouth and take it back. Even when she lived in Mexico, they didn't usually have to kill their food and dress it before they cooked it. But it wasn't such a foreign idea that it would garner a look like McCoy had just given her. She'd meant it as a joke. His lips curved up. "I was over with the rattlesnakes. I've heard they're good, but they're out of season. Don't think it would do for me to be making them lunch."
"I'm not hungry for snake anyway."
"That's nice. I wouldn't know how to cook it. And," he eyed her with a raised brow, "I'm not sure I want you to."
"Wow, really? I burn one meal, one time, and he's going to rub it in forever."
It was well beyond the burnt stage. Charred, mummified, so burnt the dogs wouldn't even eat it. She put a hand up.
"Okay, I get the picture. I always figure there's no point in doing something halfway."
Yep, there was no halfway about it. It was burnt the whole way through.
"So, you're a great cook?"
she asked. There was no way she was winning that argument. He wasn't wrong about how badly she'd burnt it. "Passable, I'd say. I can make coffee, boil pasta, grill hamburgers." He tilted his head. "Is there anything else?"
"Samita with Milanese, Pizzole, Cochinita Pibil."
And suddenly she realized she was being way too transparent.
"French fries?"
He snorted. Gah. She tried to move on, but he remained motionless, his head tilted to the side. So, I don't think your accent is purely Spanish, but I'm assuming you speak the language, since you said those things, whatever they are, with what sounded like native authenticity to me. Yeah, how could he not pick up on that?
Hey, hot sausage. I could go for a sandwich.
She pointed to the nearest booth. Hot sausage wasn't her favorite, but it made McCoy's eyes light up, and he finally started moving again. They stepped in line, which wasn't overly long, since the lunch rush had ended hours ago. Should we get something for Snickers? McCoy asked.
I think she's fine. She ate this morning before we came, and I just gave her a drink of water.
After checking to see if she wanted a drink, he stepped up and ordered them both a sandwich and a water, along with a large order of cheese fries. After the vendor handed them their food, McCoy said, "If you don't mind walking a bit, there's a pretty spot by the river that won't be crowded. After your busy morning, I'd assume you could use a quiet break." Could she ever? She'd never thought she would be busy performing and answering questions all that time.
Thank you. I don't mind at all.
She followed him past the booths and tables, Snickers at her heel. It was only 5 minutes or so when they'd rounded a small hill and reached the rocky edge of the river. Several rocks made a perfect natural seat, and the green grass and budding trees contrasted with the bright blue sky to make the spot idyllic.
I didn't even realize this was here,
she said as they situated themselves on the rocks facing each other, the river beside them. Yeah, it's pretty. It felt odd to her that McCoy would bring her to such a pretty spot. Their relationship had been contentious for the most part, but he kept surprising her with his kindness and consideration. Maybe the contention was mostly on her part. Contention and attraction. She couldn't seem to find the happy middle ground that McCoy walked so easily. She vowed to do better. She had eaten 2 bites of her sandwich before she blurted out,
"Do you bring a lot of girls here?"
His eyes snapped to hers. They widened before his lips pulled back, like he was resigned to divulge information he didn't necessarily want to talk about. I was engaged in college. It ended badly, kind of like my parents, only we weren't married. I've been focused on my job since. She nodded. She hadn't really meant anything about her and him, necessarily. Just if this was something he did regularly. She didn't want to be one of many, not with McCoy. But she didn't really understand what made her feel that way, so she let the subject drop. How's the permit process going? He asked. She stared at her sandwich, her insides rioting.
Fine,
she said. She took a fry and popped it into her mouth. The permit process wasn't happening at all, because it said right on the website that one had to be a citizen to even apply. She hadn't gotten any phone numbers from her contacts in Mexico, but she wouldn't stop working on it. In fact, as soon as she got home, she would call again. She didn't want McCoy to get in trouble when the 30 days were up and she hadn't even applied. Heidi needed to have a home before then. It's a beautiful day. Let's forget about elephant problems for a while. Sound good? McCoy asked. There was something in his eyes that made her want to forget about all her problems and just enjoy a pretty day with a handsome man. She was tempted to forget who he was and what she wasn't.
I figured you brought me back here so you could grill me in private.
She eased the words with a smile, but they were still designed to put a wall between them. I brought you here because you're working hard and you need a break. McCoy looked out over the water. And because it's pretty and so are you. Her eyes widened. He complimented her. McCoy wasn't the kind of guy to sweet-talk a girl when he didn't mean it. But what did he mean exactly? She inclined her head, trying to ignore her speeding heart.
Thanks.
He eased his legs out, angling them away from her, and crossed them. I did a lot of fishing from these rocks when I was a kid.
You probably walked here every day.
His house wasn't far away. Just about. He smiled at her. Brought my dog with me. Babe, she wasn't half as good looking as you. She thought he was flirting with her.
I'm better looking than your dog? I'll take it, I guess.
She tossed her ponytail over her shoulder and decided to throw her naturally cautious nature over her shoulder with it.
You definitely have nicer shoulders than Snickers.
Shoulders? He laughed out loud. I'm not even sure Snickers has shoulders, so I don't know what that means.
That means I can't look at your shoulders without wanting to touch them.
His laugh stopped abruptly. She had done it again, said too much. Their eyes met and held, his smoldering. Her heart trembled. She couldn't take the words back, and maybe she didn't want to anyway, because she liked the look on his face, the one that said her words had affected him, in a good way. He leaned toward her, close enough that their breaths mingled. You know you can touch them any time you want to. Why couldn't she breathe? And suddenly her throat was dry too.
I didn't know.
I'm telling you. Her fingers dug into her palm, itching to move toward the wide shoulders that were so close.
I don't want to get you in trouble,
she whispered. His lips barely moved. His eyes never strayed from hers. I think it might be worth it. Her eyes widened. He moved back just a bit. But maybe you didn't mean it. She reached out to stop him. Her hand settled on his bicep. One side of his mouth kicked up. You missed.
Maybe I'm taking the scenic route.
Her fingers curled into the hard ridges.
Maybe I'm not allowed to touch this?
His breath came out shaky. I think I'd be hard-pressed to tell you no about anything.
I think that was a yes.
That was a yes, please. Her hands slid up his arms and curled around his shoulders. They were as hard as she thought they'd be. Hot, too. And suddenly, she was drowning in his eyes, moving closer. Instead of touching his shoulders, her hands were moving around them and his lips were close, moving closer. His eyes were dark and hooded. His muscles rippled under her hand. Her heart pounded up her throat and she touched her tongue to her dry lip. A sound like a growl escaped his lips and he moved. Snickers whined. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great Jessie Gussman audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.